Well, I've done it again. I've bought another crazy M-mount lens from 7Artisans. As you know, if you've watched my reviews of their 35mm f2 and 50mm f1.1 lenses, I've got kind of a soft spot for this gutsy Chinese company. I especially appreciate their penchant for bringing back classical optical formulas at fairly reasonable prices. My new lens is their 75mm medium telephoto with a wide maximum aperture of f1.25. It's an ambitious lens. Let's see how they've done. So why did I want it? Well, I've always liked the 75mm focal length on a rangefinder camera. For portraits and headshots, it gives you a little more working room than a 50mm without being quite so standoffish as you'd have to be with an 85 or 90. If you're shooting indoor sports or theater or music, it's good for small venues with a wide maximum aperture plus reasonable size weight. Now, apparently a lot of M-mount shooters agree with me. You won't find a 75mm lens at all in the lineup of Canon or Nikon or whatever, but in M-mount there are about 6 of them, 3 from Leica and 3 from other manufacturers. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but first let's look at the 7Artisans lens itself. Like the 35 and 50 lenses I reviewed earlier, it's presentable, just a little quirky. The finish of the metal parts isn't stellar, but it's not shabby either. The focusing ring turns very smoothly, and the aperture ring felt a bit gritty at first, but smoothed out after I had used the lens a bit. That brings up one of the quirks. The aperture stops are not evenly spaced. The wider apertures are far apart, and the smaller ones are much closer together. In the old days, all lenses were like this because it was mechanically the simplest way to make the aperture mechanism. By the 1960s, most makers had switched to a more complicated mechanical design that made all the stops more equally spaced. But 7Artisans sticks to doing it the old way, and you just had to go along with it. Another quirk that's even weirder, although it doesn't affect picture taking, is that 7Artisans can't seem to make up its mind what style of lettering to use on its lens markings. If you look closely at the 35, the 50, and the 75, you'll see they all use different type styles. In most companies there's a person called the product manager who makes sure that these kinds of things are consistent. But 7Artisans just does, whatever. I kind of like that, it's just odd. I want to talk a bit about another 7Artisans signature feature that's not a quirk, it's something genuinely useful. They design their M-mount lenses so that if you have to, you can calibrate them yourself to match your specific camera's rangefinder. 7Artisans does calibrate these lenses, and every one I've had has been usable right out of the box. But if your camera happens to be at one end of the acceptable tolerance range, and your lens is at the other end, 7Artisans gives you a way to do something about it without having to send your lens to a technician. As I said, your lens probably will be fine, but I suggest you get out the chart that comes with it and take a test picture just to satisfy your curiosity. I'll sketch out an easy way to set up the chart. You're not trying to make numerical measurements, so it all doesn't need to be super precise. All you're trying to do is see whether the camera's rangefinder is right on target, a little too close, or a little too far. If you do find you need to adjust it, and again you probably don't, you can follow the instructions on the printed chart or follow the video on 7Artisans' own website. Now let me tell you an important point about the instructions on the chart. They have a mistake about how to adjust a 75mm lens. The chart says that if your lens is out of calibration, you need to turn the coupler in increments of 0.5 millimeters, which is a very tiny amount. That's correct if you're adjusting the 35mm or 50mm lens. But the 7Artisans video shows that the 75mm lens is different. Instead of 0.5 millimeters, you turn the coupler in increments of 3 millimeters. That still takes a light touch, but it's a lot more manageable. Adjustability is fine, but to me, the top feature of this 7Artisans lens is its sheer audacity. It has the same focal length and the same f1.25 maximum aperture as Leica's 75mm Noctilux lens. The Leica lens costs close to $13,000, and it has a state-of-the-art design that includes aspherical lens surfaces. Meanwhile, the 7Artisans lens costs $450, and it sticks with a classical 1940s-style optical design, including old-school spherical lens surfaces. Trying to match Leica's specs with 70-year-old technology, and at 1/26th of its price, is pretty darn cheeky, and I couldn't help wondering if 7Artisans might have bitten off a little more than it can chew this time. What we're up against is the fact that medium telephoto lenses with wide maximum apertures are, and have always been, some of the most challenging lenses to design and make. To understand why, let's go back to 1936 or so. 35mm cameras were still mostly a novelty back then, but some serious professionals were using them for subjects such as indoor sports, stage performances, and news events. For these kinds of shooting situations, the hot setup was the Zeiss Icon Contax II rangefinder camera paired with Zeiss's 85mm f2 sonar lens. Now this combination cost about as much as a new car, but nobody else, particularly Leica, had anything that could compare with it for low-light shooting. But photographers back in those days already were asking for medium telephoto lenses with an even wider maximum aperture. Now they had to, because the most sensitive low-light films back then would have had what we would consider an ISO of about 80. Photographers were forced to shoot theater and sports at such slow shutter speeds, typically around 1/25th of a second, that a lot of photos would be ruined by motion blur. So beginning in the late 1930s, camera companies started working on 85mm lenses with maximum apertures of f1.5, almost a full stop faster than the Sonar. One problem was that the Sonar design couldn't be stretched that far. It was good for f1.5 or 85mm, but not both. So companies had to turn to designs that were based on the optical theories of mathematician Carl Gauss. These Gauss-type optics needed glass elements that were thick, heavy, and steeply curved, which made them challenging to design, hard to manufacture, and tricky to assemble. Still, everybody kept trying, and by early in the Second World War, some usable 85mm f1.5 lenses began to appear. Lights got there first in 1943 with the Summer-X lens for Leicas. Zeiss called the Gauss-type lenses the Biotar family, and they had a design, but they never introduced an 85mm version. Instead, after the war, the Soviet Union seized a load of Zeiss plans and equipment as reparations, and they also offered jobs to some Zeiss factory technicians. A lot of the haul wound up at a factory called KMZ for Krasnogorsk Mechanical Works, which had made high-quality military optics for the Soviet war effort. And by the late 1940s or early 50s, KMZ had its own Biotar-inspired 85-15 called the Helios 40. Canon introduced an 85-15 lens in 1950, and Nikon followed in 1951. So now, low-light photographers had some choices. Unfortunately, it was a really hard problem, and all of the solutions were a little disappointing. The lenses were big, heavy, and very expensive. Usually they were nice and crisp at about f5.6 or smaller, but people avoided using them at full aperture, which was why they bought them, right? Unless they absolutely had to. At f1.5, fine details were just soft, and the softness wasn't even a pretty glow like you'd get with a Sonar. Everything just looked kind of mushy. There was a simple reason that was happening, and that was that when it comes to making lenses, spheres are not your friends. Until pretty recently, the only practical way to produce camera lenses was to use spherical surfaces. That meant that every surface of every glass element was shaped like a section sliced out of a sphere. Put two of these surfaces together and you had a lens. Spherical surfaces meant you could mass-produce lenses very accurately. You could take a set of glass blanks and attach them to a spherical-shaped holder, and then run a spherical-shaped polisher over them to finish them all at once. The only problem was that optical scientists had known since the 19th century that spherical surfaces were no good. A theoretically perfect lens should focus all the rays going through it to the same point. With a spherical surface, rays that went through the center would be focused at a slightly different distance from the rays that went through the edges. This was called spherical aberration. Designers could never really eliminate spherical aberration as long as they were stuck with spherical surfaces. The best they could do was correct it by combining different curves and types of glass. And the hardest lenses to correct were ones that had wide apertures and used thick, steeply curved elements, which is exactly what all the 85-1.5s had. Spherical aberration was what made the image details look mushy. Instead of having a single point of best focus, the spherical lens had what you might call a tunnel of pretty good focus. Everywhere in the tunnel there was a sharp image overlapped by a bunch of slightly out of focus images from other parts of the lens. That overlap is what made the fine details look mushy. Incidentally, that's also why a lot of these lenses are hard to focus on a modern mirrorless camera. You're never sure quite where the sharpest distance is, and focus peaking doesn't help as much as you'd hope because there's really no peak. These lenses work best on a camera with a true optical rangefinder which zaps them into focus with no fuss. Now let's take a little detour. Remember the people at Carl Zeiss who did not bring out an 85mm f1.5 lens because their design apparently took a vacation in Krasnogorsk? Well, they came up with an interesting alternative. They shrank their Biotar design down to a 75mm f1.5. Whether this change improved full aperture performance is a judgment call. I'd say maybe a little at most, but the shrink definitely made a lens that was more compact, lighter, and much nicer to shoot with. Through the 1950s and 60s, Zeiss's old plant in Jena, which was in what used to be called East Germany, cranked out scads of these 75-15 Biotars, mostly in SLR mounts, but also a few for Contax and Leica rangefinder cameras. You'd have thought the advantages of a smaller, lighter lens would be obvious, but for some reason, maybe politics, nobody else picked up on the 75mm idea until 1980, when Leica brought out a 75mm Summilux lens, along with a new camera model, the M4P, with a 75mm frame line to go with it. Incidentally, you'll find articles that say the Leica version of the Biotar is super rare. Maybe that's correct, but the fact is that I did own one during the mid-1980s. I actually bought it for $20 out of a junk box at a used camera show in Omaha, Nebraska. The metalwork was terribly worn, but the glass was in good shape, and I used it quite a bit for theater photography on a Leica M4P. Frankly, it was kind of a frustrating lens to use, but I still kept it for a long time because under the right conditions and with the right kind of subject, it produced really pretty images. This one, taken in the costume shop at a ballet performance, is one of my favorites. If you can crop in, you can see that everything is soft and flary, but you can still see just enough detail in the girl's eyelashes, hair, and costumes. I get the same kind of feeling from this grab shot that I made of my friend Amaris with the 7Artisans lens. That's me reflected in the mirror on the left. My first impression was that the whole image was really soft and blurry, but when I cropped in on Amaris' face, I could see that there's quite a lot of detail in her eyelashes and the stitching on her hat. The details have that out-of-focus overlay that you get from spherical aberration, and of course at f1.25 there's almost no depth of field, so out-of-focus areas are spilling over into everything. But it's an interesting look. I wouldn't want to use it all the time, but I think it's got possibilities. To see how much of a penalty the 7Artisans lens is paying for sticking with a classic-style design, I compared it to the only other 75mm lens I own now, the one Olympus makes for Micro Four Thirds cameras. The Olympus lens has two huge advantages. It only has to cover the Micro Four Thirds image area instead of the area of 35mm film, and its maximum aperture is almost a full stop slower than the 7Artisans lens. Both of those things make the lens designer's job much simpler. Also, the 7Artisans lens doesn't use any exotic types of optical glass, while the Olympus lens uses special, low dispersion, and high refractance glasses. Without trying to get into a numerical test, here's a simple photo that will give us a feeling for how those differences might look. To keep things even, I shot the 7Artisans lens at f1.8, the same as the Olympus lens. But the comparison is still a walkover for the Olympus. Every detail is crisp and sharp. The 7Artisans lens shows fairly fine details, but they're hazy and soft and mushy. Things get a lot more equal when we shoot both lenses at f5.6. The Olympus lens looks about the same, still very sharp and crisp. But the 7Artisans lens has caught up a lot, because stopping it down to f5.6 has eliminated a lot of the spherical aberration. The Olympus lens is still just a touch better, but I'd be happy with the 7Artisans results. Now let's see how those differences play out in real-world shooting. For a quick look, I took both lenses to a ballet rehearsal and kept swapping them back and forth on my Olympus Pen F. Here's a pair of pictures that I chose because they're fairly similar. Let's crop in on Jessica, the dancer on the left. There's no question that the Olympus lens on the right gives a sharper, clearer image of Jessica's eyelashes and hair. The 7Artisans lens on the left actually has a lot of fine detail. You can still see individual eyelashes and individual strands of hair. They're not as crisply defined as with the Olympus, but maybe for your taste that's not a problem. Looking out more toward the corner, in the 7Artisans picture, Jessica's fingernails and waistline have some flary highlights around them, while the Olympus version is clear and crisp. Overall, there's no question that the Olympus images are technically superior, but they may not be superior in a way that you care about. One photographer might say, it's a lot easier to blur a sharp image than to sharpen a blurry image, so the Olympus lens is a better choice. But another photographer might say, shooting with the 7Artisans lens will save me a ton of time because I won't have to retouch out every mascara flake and skin pore. The choice really comes down to what kinds of traits you care about in your pictures. Now, since the 7Artisans lens is a modern recreation of an old-school design, let's compare it to one of those old lenses to see if there's been any progress in the past 70 years. Unfortunately, we can't compare it to my 75mm Biotar because I don't have the Biotar anymore. It got so rickety and unreliable that I sold it to someone who knew what it was and could afford to give it a full mechanical restoration. But I do have one of the original generation of 85-15s, the Canon lens that was introduced in 1950. Mine is a slightly later model, but the optical design is the same as the original. Comparing the block diagrams, you can see that the 7Artisans lens is the same general type, but it's a genuinely fresh design. For example, look at the second group from the left. On the Canon lens, these two elements are cemented together. Canon probably did that to make sure the elements stayed aligned during assembly. On the 7Artisans lens, those elements are split with a very thin space between them. And I'm guessing that 7Artisans did that to let the designer squeeze out a little more performance. It's the same on the far right. The Canon has one thick, solid element, and 7Artisans uses two thinner elements with a small gap between them. My interpretation is that 7Artisans started with a classical layout and then tweaked it to take advantage of modern advances in computerized optical design and precision machining. I compared both lenses on the digital camera using my trusty bookshelf. At f1.5, the 7Artisans lens on the right has the same slightly soft quality we saw before, but it's hugely better than the Canon lens on the left. It looks like 7Artisans design tweaks have paid off, and that 70 years of progress do count for something. Stop them down to f5.6 though, and the differences just disappear. I honestly didn't expect my 70-year-old Canon lens to look this good. It's neck and neck with the 7Artisans lens. This confirms that the designers of the 1950s knew what they were doing, and it also shows how stopping down really helps with all spherical lens designs. Just for you film shooting fans, I tried the same comparison on a film camera using Ilford Pan F Plus film, which is a fine-grained black and white film with an ISO speed of 50. Frankly, the differences here are less dramatic because a lot of the image structure gets lost in the grain of the film. Again, stopping down makes the images more crisp, but the film's grain structure masks most of the benefit. I'll leave it to you to decide whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Now, finally, we can summarize my take on the 7Artisans 75mm f1.25 lens. Like the other 7Artisans lenses I've tried, its metal finish isn't superb, but it's not bad. It works smoothly. Like the other 7Artisans lenses, it's got a few design quirks, but you can get used to them easily, and it does have the advantage of letting you adjust the rangefinder coupler if you need to. As I've said in my other 7Artisans reviews, I feel it makes the most sense to use it on a true rangefinder camera. You can adapt it to a mirrorless camera, but it will be harder to focus, and you're paying for features you don't need. In terms of performance, at large apertures, it will not give you a sharp, crisp, modern look. If that's what you want in your 75mm lens, and if you also want to shoot at f1.25, you'll need to hand Leica that $13,000 for a 75mm Noctilux. On the other hand, if you want a sharp 75mm lens and you like to shoot at about f5.6, with Studio Flash for example, the 7Artisan lens will give you what you want. At that aperture, it gives you lots of crispness and detail. It's in between f1.25 and f5.6 that things get interesting. Somewhere in that range there may be a perfect aperture that gives you exactly the balance you want between too much blur and too much sharpness. All you've got to do is find it. It's your chance to choose your own adventure. You'll like that if you believe that sharpness isn't everything.